Hi, my name is Paul Jones. Welcome to the Australian National University's contribution to TASA November. First, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would like also to pay my respects to elders past and present. We are joining you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people. I also need to advise that today's proceedings are in Zoom webinar format and are being recorded. We've called our event Sociology Goes Public. It draws heavily on the depth and richness of our postgraduate community here at ANU Sociology. This afternoon is organised around 3 sessions, 2 panels, one that's about to commence, another on digital media policy, and then at the end of the day, a book launch related to populism. So let's move to the first panel, Sociology Goes to Work, exploring the value of sociology education in the workplace. Tate McAllister is the organiser and chair of this panel. Tate is Assistant Director in the ACT Government Office of LGBTIQ+ Affairs. Alongside his work, he is completing a PhD in sociology at ANU, where he researches transmasculinity and embodiment. Over to you, Tate.
Thanks very much, Paul, for that welcome and acknowledgement of country and introduction. So I'm joined today by Dr. Gemma Killen. Gemma is a writer, researcher, and social advocate. She recently completed a PhD in sociology here at ANU, specialising in gender, sexuality, and community making. She is currently working as the Senior Policy Officer at the ACT Council of Social Service, where her policy portfolios include issues relating to justice, alcohol and other drugs, gender, sexuality, families, young people, and education. Quite a list. Thanks, Gem. I'm also joined today by Isabel Mudford, who is a political advisor to the ACT Greens and a PhD candidate in sociology, also here at the ANU, where she researches the emergence of the category of LGBTIQ+ health in Australia, and she specialises in gender and sexuality policy. Just a quick reminder before we get into it, there's a Q&A function when you can write in a question. So feel free to do so at any point during the discussion and we'll try and get to them while we're talking, but if not, I'll leave some time at the end as well for us to get to some of those questions. So just as a brief preamble, I'm somewhat ambitiously hoping today to have 2 interlinked conversations. One is about the kinds of work that sociology PhD graduates might do and about what those trained in sociology can bring to non-academic workplaces. I think this is a useful discussion, both in the context of thinking about a variety of post-PhD career opportunities and in the context of defending sociology as an academic discipline of public value and a discipline that might train professionals for a range of roles and workplaces. The other conversation I'm hoping to have provides a background to this and is about the current conditions of work in universities and about the way that academic careers are conceptualised. It's well acknowledged that in Australia there are far more PhD graduates than there are academic jobs available. Even those who are successful in gaining academic jobs increasingly face casualisation and wage theft, and with the estimated thousands of full-time jobs lost at Australian universities over the last 2 years, those who do remain are increasingly saddled with unsustainable workloads between teaching, research, publication expectations, and administration and management tasks. Intertwined with these factors is the devaluing of social science higher education as a public good. In response to the Australian government preventing public universities from accessing JobKeeper during the pandemic and to increasing fees on humanities and social sciences courses in the name of prioritising job-ready degrees, universities are increasingly adopting cost-saving management policies that have led to the cutting of courses and subjects, and in the case of one Australian university, their proposal to abolish their entire social science department. This situation raises increasing questions about the purpose of disciplines like sociology that do not correspond directly to specific professional jobs, and about what the purpose of a PhD is, if not to train academics. So these are conversations that I know we've had between the 3 of us, and I'm sure have occurred between many others, but I don't think it's a conversation that typically occurs in forums like TASA. Indeed, I think there's a strand in academia that views PhD graduates who pursue non-academic careers as a sign of failure. So as 3 people who are at or nearing the end of our PhD journeys and who are all engaged in work outside the university and contemplating our future career trajectories, I think we're well placed to start a discussion about this. So with that preamble, Gemma, I was wondering if you could kick us off by talking a little bit more about your PhD, your background in it, and how you use that when starting the workplace to kind of frame yourself as a desirable candidate and employee.
So my PhD was about community making online for queer women. It feels like a distant dream a little bit now, which is a weird thing after you've spent so long really immersed in a topic to go out into the world and not engage with that topic as much anymore. It's a good question, Tate, but actually when I applied for my job, I applied for a comms position and didn't talk about my PhD at all. And in fact, lots of people told me that when trying to get work in the community sector, to minimize the discussion of my PhD. Luckily, the place that I ended up working at ATCOS sees value in sociological research. And they said, we don't want you to do a comms job. We want you to come and do a senior policy job for us instead. So that was good for me that I landed there. But I can talk a little bit about how my research skills have sort of translated into the work that I do. Perhaps with an example, at the moment I'm writing a submission to the government's inquiry on community corrections in the ACT. And so that has required a lot of lit review kind of research on community corrections, a lot of things that I didn't know about before that I had to research, but it's also required lots of consultation. So that's working with other organizations in the sector on what they think about community corrections, and required my interview skills, meeting with individuals and groups of individuals that have a stake in justice and how it happens in the ACT, and then bringing that information together and being able to write a coherent report that someone else can then use as a piece of evidence for changing legislation. Yeah, that's kind of a really short breakdown of what I do all the time now. Yeah.
Thanks, Jen. We might come back to a question about why you didn't want to include your PhD, because I think that's a really interesting topic. But yeah. Izzy, I might just jump to you and sort of similar question, just a bit about your PhD and if you did sort of include it when you're applying for your current job, how you framed that.
Sure, thanks, Tate. So yeah, my PhD is in critical public health. I'm examining the category of LGBTIQ health. I am about half to 3/4 of the way through my PhD. It's kind of hard sometimes to put a timeline on these things. It's not as linear, at least my experience of it hasn't been particularly linear. But like Gemma, I received a lot of advice about de-emphasizing the PhD, or at least contextualizing the PhD alongside kind of like skills translation work that I've done previously. But for me, I was lucky enough to get a job in which my understanding of the LGBTIQ health service sector was actually highly desirable. And so I was able to talk about it a fair bit, and it was seen, I think, even though there wasn't necessarily a very strong understanding of what a PhD necessarily is or what kind of training necessarily goes into a PhD, there certainly was, I certainly experienced a bit of privilege on the basis of being considered or constituted as an expert in the space that they wanted skills within. But then it's been an interesting experience in how the workplace has been able to or not support my research and my continued work on the PhD while I've been employed, and their understanding of, I guess, the kinds of work I'm doing outside of the workplace on it. Yeah.
Yeah. So Gemma, and I mean Izzy as well, do you want to say anything about why other people kind of gave you this advice? Don't include why you have, that you have a PhD. Like, what was the kind of reasoning behind that idea?
I think a lot of people don't understand at all what is involved in doing a PhD. And I went to a like a consultation roundtable held by the government in probably my first week or two in the new job. And so I was meeting a lot of people and, you know, saying that I've just started at ACCOS, and lots of people asked me where I'd come from. And I said to one person who was, I can't remember who it is now, but was like quite a senior person. I said, I've just finished a PhD. And she was like, oh, so you've been a student. You're just like fresh out of uni then. And I wanted to have, it was a professional situation. So I was like, oh, yes. But I also wanted to be like, you know, I'm in my mid-30s and I view my PhD as having been my job and my academic, part of my academic career for the last few years. And I don't see myself as having been just a student for the last 10 years, you know, and obviously I've been working through my PhD as well. But I think a lot of people have that idea that that you've been a student, just a student, and you have no sense of work if you've been a PhD student, and that you're very siloed, that you've spent years focusing on one particular thing, and you're not able to expand beyond that.
Yeah. Izzy, did you?
I think that last point that Gemma mentioned was, I guess, the context of the discussions that has resonated in my mind about like people perceiving your knowledge to be so specific and discrete that it can't be applied, and that it can't be like generally applicable to a range of issues. And so I guess well, first of all, I actually think any PhD is of incredible value in the workplace. I mean, the fact that people are able to manage manage a PhD is a significant attribute that not a lot of people in the workplace after years of working in workplaces actually have. Being able to manage a project through to completion, especially projects like we have in sociology, which are largely self-motivated projects, and all the skills around writing and concise writing and being able to take on feedback, being able to work with other people. And I think that, you know, I think so specifically, I think PhDs, I think are very, very useful ways of measuring lots of different things about a job applicant. But then I think quite specifically a sociological PhD allows you insight in social policy fields in a way in that actually is sadly quite rare, about being able to, you know, very simply like see beyond the individual, consider social problems, for the impact that they have on the intersectional kind of impact that they have on a range of different public policy matters. And I also think Gemma did touch on this a bit in her the answer to the first question, but I think it's worth picking up the idea about like methodologies and what the value of methodologies is within the kind of workplace outside of academia, because I think this is kind of under-considered a little bit about just how important being able to consider things like power relations within the interview for things like stakeholder consultation and policy development and community engagement. I mean, that kind of like deep theoretical considered work that we do about what it means to interview, the spaces in which we interview, the people that we interview and why we interview them. These are questions that aren't actually necessarily deeply considered in my experience within workplaces, but they are things that sociology PhDs, particularly qualitative PhDs, come to the table with already. And I think that, they enable us to ask really important questions within the workplace about the types of work we do and the communities we're doing it with.
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting that you say that, because I guess I had a slightly different experience when, you know, kind of applying for my current job, in that I really put my sort of PhD experience front and center. And a big part of that was around the methodology and sort of, you know, I have a lot of experience, you know, interviewing people and kind of asking difficult questions, I guess, and also being quite critical of the things that they're saying. And I think in my role with government, you know, a huge amount of the work we do really is stakeholder engagement and learning from stakeholders, you know, from a variety of different professions and background. And I think both, you know, my academic skills have really equipped me to do that well. But also I framed them as valuable, and I think clearly my employers did view they were valuable to some extent, otherwise they probably wouldn't have hired me. But I think the question that we're sort of circling around a little bit here as well is sort of what is the purpose of a PhD? Because I think we've highlighted PhD is not particularly well understood sort of outside the university. I think there isn't a lot of awareness about what it's for or what it does. But I think even within the university, especially academics, do view it very much as a research training program for future academics. So I'm wondering sort of what some of your responses are to that idea, and have you always thought about sort of an academic future, or is moving into another workplace why you wanted to do a PhD, because you thought it would give you skills for another type of job?
Do you want to answer first?
Sure. So I have worked throughout my undergrad in the community sector in Canberra. I've always found value personally for my sense of self-worth. I don't know why we don't need to psychoanalyze me today, but I've always found value in paid employment alongside study. And so I guess I did between my honours year and starting the PhD, I did a grad year at the Federal Department of Health. And so I kind of started the PhD with some work experience already, and I certainly didn't start the PhD in a position where academia was all or nothing for me. I think it's certainly worthy of further exploration in this discussion about the kind of weird academic, non-academic binary that we all seem to enforce. But I didn't start the PhD with the intent of necessarily becoming an academic. I mean, it's certainly something that I'm still really interested in and would like to pursue, but it's not for me the career that's on the pedestal to which all other careers are secondary. Being a political advisor was my dream job, and so I've been able to get into my dream job, and it doesn't mean in the future that I wouldn't be interested in a job in academia, and if I'm in the privileged position to be able to put my all into getting one, then maybe in the future that will be something that I look forward to. But I think on balance for me at the moment, I mean, the pros of non-academic work seem to outweigh the cons, and I hope that in choosing a non-academic workplace that I haven't cut my options off entirely. In fact, I hope actually that it's expanded my options and given me skills that hopefully will be able to translate back into academia, because as much as a PhD actually translates and is it's in some ways a tough translation into non-academic work, I think there's also a bit of work to be done on translating non-academic work back into academia and the value of non-academic work into academia. And I think some of that translation is around how you talk to people who don't have an academic background, how you can show kind of universities have an ever increasing interest in impact and whatever that kind of means. But I think non-academic work, I hope, will be able to help me translate some of that kind of impact stuff and talk about what impact, and be a bit creative with my methods reverse, knowing what I know now about how to convince people to enact change. Did that answer the question, or did I just ramble? I mean, I rambled, but did I also answer the question?
I think you did also answer it, and I definitely think we're going to come back to this idea of the academic sort of non-academic binary. But Gemma, I was wondering if you wanted to add anything as well.
It's still a question that I really grapple with, this idea of the academic path versus the non-academic path. And I guess it's kind of, I worked in retail and hospitality before I came to uni, and I failed out of high school, and then I had 6 years or something of working pretty shit jobs before I started uni, and my expectation when I started uni was that I would fail out of that relatively fast, and I didn't, and so it became pretty much my only love. my deep passion for uni because I was good at it and it felt like the only thing that I was good at for a really, really, really long time. And I think as I finished my PhD and I kind of faced the kind of academic landscape that we're in now, where the jobs are not really apparent, and that I would have to go somewhere else, it was a deep moment of grief actually for me to think about going somewhere else. I think, that's something that we have to talk about as well, that like you said, we always frame it as this kind of failure or success, but sometimes we have to make other decisions and they have a lot of emotional baggage with them too. Yeah, we can psychoanalyze me as well if you like, Izzy.
Maybe we can do that later. I think it is worth maybe touching a little bit on some of these, I guess, the kind of like baggage of working in an academic space, or that's maybe not quite the right way to phrase it. But, for me, I guess I've sort of viewed an academic career as somewhat of an impossibility for me. And that's not because I don't think I'm, smart enough or good enough, but really because the kinds of conditions that would require me to work in the university is not the kind of way I want to live my life. So, in that regard, I have always had a non-academic career is really kind of my plan A, and what I want to do. But I guess, this is really a question about working in the university, and I think making it as a young academic in this current environment really requires a very particular kind of person, and someone who maybe doesn't have a family or doesn't have particular responsibilities that they have to make decisions about. So I was wondering maybe if either of you had any thoughts about that particular issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, just one of the most immediate things for my family was, getting a mortgage to get a house. And banks won't even entertain if you're on a contract. If you're casual, then they definitely won't entertain a mortgage. But if you're on a contract of a year or 2 years, they won't entertain the idea of a mortgage. And it seems like it's impossible to get a continuing academic position until you've been through a cycle of, say, 3 contracts of 2 years. And that's just like a fundamental thing that you don't then have access to. And beyond that, there's so much moving. And I think in Canberra, that's particularly difficult. Like if you have to move to a different university, then really you have to move interstate or overseas. And that's becoming increasingly difficult in the current climate as well. There's so many things that you have to not be tied to in order to pursue that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess to get back to this question of the sort of academic, non-academic binary, we have sort of been talking about it a little bit here as it is a binary. It's, you choose one or the other, right? I'm interested in hearing both of your thoughts about why have we set up this system, and is it actually a binary, or do we just talk about it in that way? Izzy, I wonder if you want to start.
I'm not sure. I think I'm still in an exploration phase about it. I think certainly the kind of discourse at the university is very negative about the early career of an academic. I certainly have rarely experienced people speak about that experience that Gem's talking about in a positive light, and for the joy and excitement that it can bring. It's very much certainly constituted from the very beginning as a burden. And it makes me think about, the types of people that the university is curating for big future academics, and what sorts of people it wants to retain, and what amazing talent and diversity of topic and of interest and of discipline the university is losing on the basis of not being able to provide or not being willing to provide job security to young people, but young women in particular is what kind of is front and center in my mind. So I think that's an interesting question about what kind of care is being put into the future that universities are envisioning for themselves in terms of the diversity of people that they hope to retain. And I think there's this kind of idea that, like, if you're smart enough and you work hard enough to be able to do that early career stage, then you're the right person for academia. But I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of, like, who is able to do hard work, basically, I think it's just, and the value of people who can't, for whatever reason, do that kind of make that kind of commitment, particularly at this point in our lives. You know, like, we're finishing PhDs. A lot of people, not everybody, are finishing PhDs as we head into our 30s, and it's not really a time for more insecurity for a lot of people. So, I mean, doing a PhD in and of itself is, like, quite a sacrifice, I think. Well, not just a sacrifice, it's obviously a reflection of privilege and opportunity as well, but it's also a significant sacrifice. I'm also understanding that I'm not really answering the question that you asked. But certainly these are the things that are going through my mind right now. I think that the binary is prevalent more, the conversation about the binary, whether or not the binary is real, I don't know, and I'm still trying to figure that out myself, but the conversation about the binary is certainly more prevalent within the university, whereas I think people in the workplace so far haven't been like, oh, well, you couldn't possibly go back into academia. Like, there's not, like, a really strong understanding of what academia really looks like within at least my workplace, and what I don't think that people see it as something that you kind of, that I haven't chosen. It's like this, like, future possibility, which is also a really empowering space to be in for me, you know, in this environment, to be in an environment where people still see that as an opportunity for me, as an area of excitement. Whereas I find at the uni, I think people have categorized me as one of those people that's not going to pursue academia, which may be true, but also may not be true. Yeah.
I think
yeah, you go.
I was just going to say, Gemma, if I could get you, I think maybe to talk a little bit further about this idea Izzy's raised of sort of like that once you've left the university and have a non-academic job that you can't necessarily then get back. You know, what are your thoughts about that, or your experiences?
I think we often, in the university, it's often described as a leaky pipeline. And I think that illuminates something as well, that something gets lost. And even when Izzy was talking, we were talking about who gets lost from the academic stream. And I think that just tells us that we imagine that people who step out are being lost. Whereas, I don't know, in the community sector, perhaps we don't necessarily talk about people who take private jobs or go to government as lost in forever. You know, there's like a permeability there, whereas in the university, there tends to be this idea that you're either in the university or you're outside of the university. And even more, even within the university, your academic staff or your professional staff, that, like, these binaries keep hardening around what is the ultimate researcher within a university. I think that binary still exists, and I think it's not that people who work in universities are not open to people who've been working outside of universities to coming in, but I think the systems and the structures, like Izzy said, like around rankings and things like that, produce this kind of hardening of a border around the academic job, that means it's much harder to get back in than it is to go out.
Yeah, when I think about that, I think especially about things like publications, because it is, if you've been outside working in a professional role, I mean, some people do professional roles and do still submit publications, but often most people aren't publishing whilst they're doing those roles, and then maybe in 5 or 10 years they are interested in taking an academic position. Well, you know, so much of that is based on research publications. If you don't have that, you know, you have very little chance competing against applicants who do. So I think that is, you know, one part of that, as well as around, you know, the ways that we prioritize particular types of output and, you know, kind of experiences.
Yeah, for sure.
I just want to add, I think it's an interesting thing I've thought about for a while, is also the kind of intense critique of the university as an institution that sociologists are really good at, and I think is very, very worthy and valid. But I think also that the kind of non-academic academic binary is reinforced by this kind of like, oh, the corporate neoliberal university, as if like corporate neoliberalism doesn't like permeate every part of our society. You know, like job insecurity, casualization, corporatization, like particularly in the city that we're in, which is like a, you know, a university / public service town. I mean, the community sector is grappling with significant under-resourcing. The public sector jobs are being contracted out to large commercial firms. Like, I think it's kind of, like, you know, people are more and more on short-term contracts. People are more and more in casualized jobs, even within these kind of, you know, the community sector and the public service, which used to be seen as kind of like permanent places upon which you could have a career. So the idea that like the university is the only site of precarity, I think is a bit naive. It doesn't mean that there isn't a particular toxicity to that kind of environment, but it's certainly not unique to that environment. And certainly like non-academic work shouldn't be considered like necessarily like safe. I think that kind of critique should be brought outside the university as well. Which is not a like positive spin about, hey guys, everyone should have a non-academic job. But certainly it's not like you either choose the hard path of academia, which is super precarious and terrible, but you're really in it, or you choose this kind of like easy road of non-academic work, because like these issues are everywhere.
Yeah, and I think like even thinking about the precarity and the hard path of academia, it's not just that the jobs are more precarious, it's that the whole context of the world is more precarious as well. You know, even something like housing prices at the moment mean that it's a different decision to take a precarious role than it would have been 10, 20 years ago, because costs are so much higher in the community. Things like housing are the cost of housing is so much more above what we might make in a precarious role, that it changes the kind of risk that you're willing to take, if that makes sense. So it's not just about the neoliberalism of the university, but the whole world. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this goes to Simon put in a question a little while ago, which was about the sort of difficulty of being an early career researcher and what we can do about that. But I think, unfortunately, as we've sort of just illustrated, that problem is not isolated to the university, and we're really dealing with like huge structural systemic issues here that affect workplaces kind of across the board. And unfortunately, I don't really think there are any easy solutions to this, unless either of you have anything you want to offer as a panacea.
I think maybe more people should do PhDs in sociology.
Yeah, I mean, well, to change tracks a little bit, I think though, is in response to your question, I'm really interested in what both of you see as the value of a PhD in sociology specifically, as opposed to other kind of related discipline, you know, anthropology, philosophy, history, kind of, what is it that sociology might be bringing to kind of people who do want professional roles in the kinds of environments we are, you know, the public service, politics, community services. Why should they do sociology?
Izzy nailed it on the head earlier when she said it's about like a criticism and a critical engagement with power, not just in our methodologies for getting, you know, consultations done and stuff, but also for understanding how policy and legislation should operate in relation to how power is operating in our society. I think that's something that sociology is famous for, thinking about power, right? And it really gives us those kinds of critical skills that are important.
Yeah. Izzy, did you have anything to add? Or?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary, and I'm you know, it's not that the disciplines that, say, in Joanna's question, for example, it's not to say that those disciplines wouldn't also offer their own particular skills and nuances and additions to the workplace. But I think in terms of what sociology offers, it offers like, it offers a social policy analysis that I think is actually surprisingly rare, and that is, about power.
Yeah. And I mean, I think related to this as well, and I know Gemma, this is something you've mentioned before, is the way that people actually come into sociology PhDs, or, you know, I think when people who are early undergraduates or maybe even just leaving high school and thinking about university, when they're thinking about the kinds of future careers and maybe they are interested in the public service, politics, all these kinds of things, I think there is a tendency to think of things like political science as the kind of better degree for that role. But I mean, that isn't necessarily true. Gemma, do you want to kind of provide more info about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's everything that we've said about how sociology can expose you to the kind of methods that you need to really do policy well, and to think about how to engage with those kinds of issues that social policy people often need to engage with, around power and marginalization, and how it operates. But also, I think we always underestimate the power of good writing, and I think like people who can write well assume that everyone can write really well, and that's not true. And a lot of people can't write well at all. But I think if you get through a PhD, then generally that's an indicator that you're able to make coherent arguments and articulate them really well. And I think that's also so important in policy. Like if you're trying to, as in our case at ATCOS, if you're trying to convince the government to do a particular thing, then it's really helpful to be able to say that really clearly and to be able to back it up with clear evidence as well. All of those things that I do come from my sociological education. Yeah.
Yeah. Izzy, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think,
No?
I mean, I think, you know, Celia's point that she just put in the chat about how, you know, sociology also offers a kind of breadth of theme, a breadth of topic and a breadth of methodology is really important as well. I did a gender studies undergrad and gender studies honours, and like really if the gender studies department existed still, I would probably be doing a gender studies PhD. So I think any of these kind of anti-disciplinary or cross-disciplinary things are also like extremely valuable. I mean, talk about a degree that is like completely undervalued and stigmatized. The gender studies degree is probably up there. But certainly what it's, you know, talk about an analysis of power. And yeah, I think one of the benefits of having done that, I used to see the fact that I'd done a cross-disciplinary undergrad as a negative thing, particularly when I first started my sociology PhD, and I was a bit intimidated by people who were able to kind of call on kind of base sociological theory that I was like, well, I actually didn't do my training in sociology, so I'm not actually fully across what it is you're talking about. And still today people drop things, I'm like, oh God, I'm going to pretend I know that. But I think certainly in the workplace, having cut across a range of different disciplines, I kind of understand a little bit about a lot of those disciplines and a little bit about what they can offer, not only in my academic work, but also, yeah, my work within politics, I guess, or not the other non-academic work that I've done.
So true. And I, like you said before, my policy areas at work are so broad, and that if I didn't have the kind of sociological gender studies background that I have, it would make it really difficult. You know, in a given week, I'm working on like 3 or 4 different submissions at a time sometimes, and they on like justice, and then alcohol, and then gender, and then also on discrimination more broadly. And I think without that background, it would be really hard to go between those things. Yeah,
absolutely. I feel we have talked in sort of fairly general terms, but I would be really interested, Izzy, if maybe you could give a more specific example of a particular thing you're working on and how you've utilised some of your sociology skills in the workplace. I'll put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. I'm trying to think of something that's not a secret. So we're putting together our office is putting together some legislation at the moment to make some changes to the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act, which go to the way that identity documents reveal or don't reveal or describe or don't describe sex and or gender. and I guess my quite niche sociological and gender studies background, as well as my work background, has enabled me to be able to really grapple with conversations about what the role of a document is in the formation of identity, what these kinds of affirmations offer people, as well as like how people more broadly than those impacted, what I would call an impacted community, so say for example trans and gender diverse communities, how people more broadly might grapple with these problems and what the value of a document is, and what a birth certificate kind of, and sex on a birth certificate represents more largely, more broadly I mean. And so I guess it's enabled me to understand the micro impact that it might have on the day-to-day lived experience of a person who needs their gender to be affirmed on a document in order to enable them to kind of move through society, as well as understand how questions about what these kinds of changes represent at large and the histories behind them, and what that might, the kind of attachments and insecurities that people put on gender and sex, and the questions that might be raised by the types of reforms that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Thanks. That's a really fantastic example. We've had a couple of questions put in the Q&A, and encourage anyone to put anything in if they want. But Celia's asked a question about the pace and timing of academic work and whether you've experienced it as quite different to PhD work. So I was wondering, do you have any thoughts about that? Do you feel like you're working more, working less? Is it different? How is it different?
I was thinking about this before actually, and I was thinking about how rather than working more or less, the non-academic work feels faster. Like I've been in my role for 10 months, I think, and there are things that have changed legislatively in that time from things that we work on in the office. And I think that's like, when you're working on academic stuff, research is slow, as I think it should be, but publication is also excessively slow. So by the time you have something tangible to think about the impact of your work, it's quite far along. Whereas, in policy work, we write submissions, we have meetings, and then sometimes, fingers crossed, the government says, oh yeah, we agree, we'll try to change that thing based on your recommendation. And that's quite quick. And I think that can be really rewarding, the quick pace of it. But also in terms of working more and less, I work a 4-day week, and that's really nice. And our CEO is the only person in our office of about 20 people that works a 5-day week. Everybody else works 4 days or less. And that's quite normal. And I think that academia offers like a high level of flexibility, but often people are working more than a 5-day week in my experience, or at least if you're not working, you're thinking about work, whereas I have every Wednesday off, and 90% of the time I don't even think about my office or my job on Wednesdays, which is a baffling experience after so many years in the university to just be like, oh yeah, I'm not going to think about that now.
Yeah, I mean, that totally would echo my experience as well, is that there's a much, I think, for lack of a better phrase, a much better sort of work-life balance. And I think workplaces, non-academic workplaces, really sort of respect when you're not at work, that you're not at work and you're not expected to be thinking about work. Depends on the workplace.
I think it depends on the workplace, and probably it depends on the university environment as well. But, like Izzy said before, the community sector is like terribly underfunded and under-resourced. Yes. So I think for certain pockets of the community sector, work-life balance is terrible, and people are doing 3 people's jobs at once. But for some of us, we're in really good workplaces that support good work-life balance. I'm not sure that Izzy has a good work-life balance. What do you reckon?
I think, some weeks, but also I think politics is one of those things that can be like completely overwhelming if you let it be. because there's work to do at work, which is like policy work, and then there's work to do, which is party work, and you do that on the weekends, and like you can devote your whole life to these organisations. And I think it's probably maybe less so for the ACT government. I mean, I think my experience is that the community sector also can demand a certain level of like whole of self commitment, but politics can be a completely overwhelming industry. It's a weird word, but like thing to be involved in. But luckily I kind of like live and breathe it, so I don't mind too much. I kind of love it. But I was going to add something. Oh, the pace of work. Yeah. I completely agree with Gemma here. It's immensely fulfilling. Like, this is the most fulfilling job I've ever had. It's just incredible. Like, we can come up with ideas or learn ideas from people literally like Gemma, and then just take them and run with them and see them through. And like, I wanted a job like this because I had been analysing power of the workplace and trying to figure out where decisions are made and who makes them and how they're made. And I think there's lots of questions and really good sociological questions to ask about what the role of political staffing is in our society, and what kind of transparency and accountability is given to these types of roles. But I think that this is an immensely satisfying job because you can have an enormous amount of influence over people's everyday lives in a way where you can take the training that you have in sociology and apply it in a way that hopefully can try and make the world a better place. And it feels damn good. Yeah.
I think going back to this idea of pacing, like that kind of satisfaction, for me anyway, means that my writing happens much quicker. So, like I said, I'm writing multiple submissions at a time, and some of them are very lengthy, like a 30-page submission happens a lot quicker than writing 30 pages of my PhD happened. Yeah. And part of that is because I have those skills now that I didn't have before, but also because we're trying to affect a particular change, where sometimes when you're doing your PhD, you feel like the purpose of writing is to reflect your intelligence, which I think it carries a lot of baggage and a lot of weight. That, when you're putting in a submission, you're like, this has nothing to do with me or my value as an individual. It's about achieving a particular purpose.
Yeah, and I think, who was it, someone in our school, I think it was tweeting a few months ago about how, like, what we perceive to be writing and like what writing is. And I think that meant a lot to me, that like, by the time I get to Friday, which is my designated like PhD day, I've often written 10,000 words that week already on a variety of different topics. Like, a big part of my work is writing. I write speeches all the time. And so like, I think in some ways it's actually helped me strengthen the writing muscle. And also, like Gem's kind of describing, like, help me let go a little bit more about whether I'm a writer, and whether what I write is of value. And also like helped me to let go a little bit of like what I've like thought of in my mind as like academic writing, and helped me to kind of get words onto the page and practice that a bit. But I'm sure the reverse is true as well. I'm sure it influences my writing at work as well. And at least it certainly influences the types of like sources that I consider relevant, and like how I analyze information. I think even across colleagues, luckily I've got two colleagues that have very similar backgrounds to mine here, but within my own team, that the staff that I work with don't have the same kind of academic background that I do. And it's really interesting how the kind of what they perceive to be information that is rigorous and evidence that is rigorous, and the types of questions that they ask about that evidence. So I don't know where that leads, but I just think it's like immensely valuable, and it's valuable in both directions. Is I guess one of the things that I'd like to emphasize at the end, is that there's this cross-pollination is extremely beneficial on an individual level, and I think should be and could be and is extremely beneficial both to the university sector and to other sectors.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've felt really strongly. I've worked pretty much throughout my whole PhD, in sort of varying ways, originally in a community service organisation and now for the ACT government. And I've always found that doing both of those things at the same time has made me much better at each of them. I would be if I was just doing one or just doing the other. So I think having that kind of being able to move between those spaces, I think, is incredibly valuable. And to some degree, I think it would be useful for universities to think a lot more about facilitating opportunities where there are, kind of parallel tracks of working and study at the same time.
Oh, and just on that, I was thinking the other day, I was at a consultation that someone was running. I won't say who, it wasn't Izzy. And it was just terrible. Like, the facilitation of the consultation was just like completely awful. And I thought about it a lot afterwards, and I was thinking about how much teaching experience we get during the PhDs, or at least how much I got, and how that meant that I can run a consultation facilitation, with my eyes closed, and it would be really good, but that those skills are not like natural skills that people have. So that's another cross-pollination moment, I think, because we often talk about academia as just research and writing, but teaching is also a big part of academia, and that teaching skill translates well, I think, to the rest of the world too.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think we're heading towards wrapping up, but I think maybe in closing, I'm really interested to hear, Joanna's put in a question, what do you wish you knew at the start of your PhD journey? Maybe what would you tell yourself if you could kind of go back in time, or even what would you tell someone else at the start of their PhD journey about sort of the issues we've been talking about, not just anything?
I don't know. I feel like I didn't know very much at all about the structure of the university when I started my PhD. And I think having that knowledge has been really helpful towards the end, talking about the neoliberalism and the kind of factors that influence the way that we think about academic work has changed the way that I think about research as well. And certainly in the beginning, I definitely thought about my PhD as a reflection of the value of my intellect. But towards the end, when I had to get it finished, one of the things that I wish that I'd had all the way through was an emotional divestment from that work, and definitely made it easier. Like, this is something that you're trying to use to learn. So like, use your PhD as a learning opportunity rather than a reflection of yourself and what you already know. And then also that it's a job that you're doing. So, you're getting usually a stipend of a certain amount, dedicate those hours to getting the job done and thinking about what it is you want to achieve with that job. Yeah. Which is kind of unromantic, because also the thing I love about the PhD is that you get to lose yourself in this topic that you are really passionate about. But I think for your mental health and for the purposes of actually getting the thing finished, it's good to think about it as a job and to step back emotionally a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Is it?
I would really warmly support all of the things that Gemma's just talked about, but I also think, and I did have some awareness of this, hence why I made the decisions that I did, but I think for me, one of the incredible things that I've gotten out of my PhD is the mentoring from my supervisor, and the importance of the relationship between a PhD student and their supervisor. And I've been lucky enough to have a supervisor who has been very supportive of non-academic work. I remember the day I dropped the bombshell that I was going to go and work for the Greens, and she was like, okay, cool, like, let's do it. Here's how we can do it. She just kind of wasn't like, oh, what's that going to mean for your PhD? She was just like, she was always aware and always supportive that this was something I was really interested in, and also something that she wanted to support. Like, she's always been very supportive of kind of like a non-academic academic hybrid model for me. And I think if this is something that people are interested in doing, having a supervisor that is at least aware of it and creative in their thinking about how they can assist you in pursuing that kind of those kinds of opportunities is a very, very valuable resource. So yeah, that's something that I would recommend, or I guess I kind of knew it, but it's just been deeply reinforced in me, especially over the last year, about that the value of a really great relationship with your supervisor and picking someone who is honest and realistic and kind and highly, highly intelligent, like mine. Suck in, everyone.
Great, thanks, Sis. All right, well, maybe unless there's any other last minute questions anyone wants to put in, we might wrap it up there. And Paul, I think you were gonna just let people know what else is happening later today and when we're coming back.
Indeed. So thanks for that. That was a really remarkable mix of stimulating yet also sobering discussion. I don't know how you managed to do both at once, but you did. Excuse the binary. Yes, as Tate said, we're going to have a break now for, excuse me, lunch. Before we go to lunch, I just wanted to, speaking of people doing multitasking with great rewards, one of our postgraduates, Sean Ward, who appears in the next session, is also managing the digital elastic bands backstage that are keeping the whole show going. So I just wanted to acknowledge Sean's contribution here. But yes, we'll break for an hour, resume at 2 o'clock with the session on digital media and policy, which Simon Copeland's chairing, and then we'll have a tea break and then the book launch after that. So see you all in an hour. Thanks for your participation.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Tate. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for a great panel, everybody.
Thanks for having us. I'm sad we can't go and eat lunch together now, but you know.
Yeah, indeed.
Bye.